Well, welcome to this explainer. Today we are taking a deeply objective, forensic approach to what is arguably one of the most heavily debated, intensely scrutinized texts in all of human history, the Genesis creation account. So I want you to prepare yourselves for a rigorous investigation today. We are not here to debate modern science. That's not the goal. Rather, we are here to analyze ancient Hebrew lexical data, structural definitions, and specifically how those ancient definitions were applied to real-world ancient jurisprudence. Our goal today is strictly analytical. We want to impartially examine the raw data from both the strict literalist framework, which demands a very specific reading, and the scholarly counter-audit that challenges that exact framework. By looking purely at the text itself and placing it within its historical context, we're going to try and uncover what these ancient authors actually intended to communicate to their original audience. It's a fascinating journey, so let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the syllabus for our audit today. First, we will define the ancient sequence itself. Second, we'll look at the Mosaic legal framework. Third, we're going to examine New Testament timeline locks. Fourth, we'll pivot to contextual and structural exceptions. And finally, we will explore the historical theological rebuttal.
Section 1. Defining the ancient sequence.
To really understand this, we have to start at the absolute foundation. The entire theological and historical debate literally hinges on one single word. Before we can even begin to get into the complex arguments, we have to understand the most foundational building block of this text, which is the ancient biblical Hebrew singular noun, yom. Now, this translates directly to the English word day, but here is where it gets complicated. Think about our modern vernacular. When we say the word day, it can mean a strict, literal 24-hour solar cycle, right? But it can also be used colloquially to represent an entire era. Like if I were to say, hey, back in my day, you know I'm not talking about a 24-hour period. I'm talking about a general epoch of time. So the entire forensic debate we are looking at centers on exactly how this specific noun, yom, is engineered within the highly specific literary architecture of Genesis chapter 1.
Now, you might be wondering, why does this distinction matter so much? Well, literalists warn against something called the equivocation fallacy. In short, they insist on a practice called exegesis. Exegesis means you are strictly pulling the meaning directly out of the ancient text. You are seeking the author's original historical grammatical intent. On the flip side is eisegesis, which is effectively shoving our modern ideas and frameworks into a text where they don't belong. Literalists argue that attempting to stretch the days of Genesis into millions or billions of years is a textbook act of eisegesis. From this perspective, it's a deliberate attempt to impose modern, post-Enlightenment astrophysical deep-time models onto a highly structured, ancient historical narrative, a narrative that, according to the literalist view, simply never intended to accommodate those vast spans of time. They argue that we have to respect the text for what it is, rather than what modern science might want it to be.
So the crucial point here is the grammar itself. If you go and check foundational, authoritative academic resources, you'll see exactly what I mean. According to Gesenius's Hebrew grammar and the theological word book of the Old Testament, there is a very strict rule at play here. Within biblical Hebrew historical narrative, whenever a definite number is attached to the word yom, like saying first day, second day, or a third day, its meaning is immediately locked exclusively to a literal 24-hour day. And here's the kicker. There are literally zero verified exceptions to this grammatical rule anywhere in the Masoretic text. Because the ancient author went out of their way to deliberately number every single creation period in sequence, this syntactical rule completely prevents the vocabulary from expanding into unmeasured geological epochs. The text structurally forces the reader into a literal timeline.
But it doesn't just stop at numbers. There is also a highly specific temporal boundary formula used. According to scholar G.F. Hassel, this repeated evening and morning formula creates an undeniable physical boundary for the text. It structurally restricts the time frame to a single literal rotation of the Earth. Think about the physical logic here. It is completely uncompromising. You simply cannot have a geological era lasting hundreds of millions of years that possesses only a single literal sunset and a single literal sunrise. By capping each numbered day with an evening and a morning, the author is aggressively defining the parameters of the timeline.
Furthermore, the author absolutely refuses to leave the definition of the word ambiguous for the reader. Genesis 1:5 states, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. According to K.A. Matthews, the text is actually defining day as the exact physical opposite of night. It is mathematically restricting the term to the illuminated half of a very strict light and dark binary. You cannot define a millions of years long era categorically as just a period of physical illumination. It breaks the structural binary the text establishes. And to solidify this even further,
On the fourth day of the narrative, theologian J.H. Walton points out that the text anchors this binary to verifiable physical celestial mechanics. We are talking about the sun and the moon, the literal bodies which, biologically and physically govern a standard 24-hour cycle here on Earth.
Section 2. The Mosaic Legal Framework.
Okay, let's step out of Genesis for a moment and see how this was applied in reality, because this syntax had massive real-world consequences. According to scholar James Milgram, a capital offense in ancient jurisprudence requires highly specific, empirically verifiable temporal parameters. The Mosaic Law instituted a literal capital punishment mandate for violating the Sabbath day. Just think about that for a second. Magistrates in the ancient Near East had to actually physically verify the literal sundown in order to legally enforce this law. It is logically and physically impossible to execute a human being for violating a millions of years long epic. You can't regulate that. The law absolutely, categorically demands a literal enforceable boundary that a human magistrate can witness with their own eyes.
And this brings us directly to the Ten Commandments, specifically found in Exodus 20:11. The entire legal architecture of the ancient Sabbath rests entirely on a strict one-to-one parity between the human work week and the divine creation week. According to D.K. Stewart, the syntax here is incredibly telling. The text utilizes the exact same noun yom for the human week and the divine week, right there in the identical sentence. Now, the implications here are massive. If God's creation week was actually composed of distinct eras that were millions of years long, the logical and legal foundation for the human 7-day work week completely collapses. The ancient Israelites were commanded to work for 6 literal days and rest for 1 literal day, specifically because they were mimicking the literal timeline of the divine creation.
Section 3. New Testament Timeline Locks.
As we move forward chronologically into the New Testament, we have to look at how apostolic theology addresses this ancient chronological sequence. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus Christ makes a definitive theological statement that merges the macro creation of the cosmos with the microbiological creation of humanity. According to W. Grudem's systematic theology, Jesus mathematically locates both of these events at the absolute beginning of the space-time continuum. Why does this matter? Well, a deep-time evolutionary model places the arrival of Adam and Eve billions of years after the origin point of the universe, essentially putting humanity 99.9% of the way through Earth's history. But Christ's syntax here mathematically anchors humanity to the absolute beginning. Structurally, this statement outright forbids that billions of years gap.
And this timeline is fiercely defended in what theologians call Pauline soteriology, which is just a fancy term for the Apostle Paul's theology of salvation. According to D.J. Moose' analysis of Romans 5:12, the underlying legal mechanics of the gospel message require physical death to be an invasive penalty, and specifically, a penalty triggered exclusively by the sin of the first human. Now think about the structural conflict here. If deep-time geological eras are historically true, they necessitate a fossil record composed of billions of dead organisms, suffering and disease over millions of years completely prior to the existence of humanity. Placing mass death, disease, and carnivory before Adam's transgression structurally destroys the foundational New Testament premise that death is the ultimate enemy introduced into a perfect world by man.
Section 4. Contextual and Structural Exceptions.
Let's move to the other side of the aisle and see how this builds as we pivot to the peer-reviewed counter-audit, because this is where things get really interesting and where the counter-audit finds a very critical contextual clue. The literalist argument we just went through demands absolute, unwavering rigidity based on Genesis 1. But scholars point out a massive semantic shift that happens just a few sentences later. In Genesis 2:4, the author utilizes the exact same singular noun, yom, but this time it's attached to a preposition, becoming biom, which translates to in the day that. According to G.J. Wenham, in this immediate structural summary, yom is used to encompass the entire 6-day creation sequence as a single broad overarching epic. This syntactically proves that the ancient author's intent undeniably possessed the semantic flexibility to use the word day as a much longer era within the exact same literary unit. For the counter-audit, this severely undermines the demand for absolute rigidity.
And then we hit what scholars refer to as the seventh-day rupture. Remember that incredibly strict evening and morning temporal boundary formula that capped off the first 6 days? Suddenly, it just disappears. It is deliberately abandoned on the 7th day in Genesis 2:2. According to C.J. Collins, under strict ancient structural rules, this syntactical omission is profound. It's not an accident. It legally breaks the absolute physical parameters of the preceding narrative. It indicates that the 7th day of rest is actually an ongoing, open-ended theological reality rather than a closed, strict 24-hour cycle. If the seventh day is in a literal 24 hours, the counter-audits asks, why must the first 6 be?
Section 5. The Historical Theological Rebuttal.
Now, it's really easy to assume that non-literal readings of Genesis are just modern post-Enlightenment compromises designed to somehow fit secular science into the Bible. But historical data heavily contradicts that assumption. The timeline proves that foremost theologians applying very early exegetical methods were debating non-literal frameworks millennia before the Enlightenment and long before the advent of modern astrophysical deep-time models. These ancient debates were rooted entirely in the friction of the text itself, not in secular scientific pressure. They were reading the text and realizing it was structurally complex.
And this brilliantly illustrates that exact point. Writing over 1,000 years before the Enlightenment ever happened, Augustine of Hippo realized a major structural logical problem within the text itself. How can you possibly have literal 24-hour solar days when the text says the sun wasn't even created until day 4? In his monumental work City of God, Augustine explicitly rejected solar literalism. He reasoned that the days of Genesis 1 could not possibly be restricted to standard solar cycles. According to Augustine, it was extremely difficult, or perhaps impossible, to determine what kind of days these were. This historical record proves that ancient exegesis naturally accommodated mystery and epochal thinking, completely independent of modern scientific theory.
The counter-audit also goes back and directly addresses the theology of death found in Romans 5 that we talked about earlier. While the literalist view claims that any death before the fall structurally destroys the gospel, a much closer look at the actual Greek syntax offers a very different parameter. According to J.H. Walton, Paul structurally connects the entrance of death to Adam's transgression, absolutely. But the Greek syntax specifically uses the term anthropos, which strictly translates to humanity. It explicitly restricts the penalty spread to human beings. In other words, Paul's text explicitly ties human death to the fall. But, structurally speaking, the text doesn't strictly forbid a leaf from falling, a cell from decaying, or an animal from dying in the natural order before Adam arrived. It strictly limits the penal nature of death to humanity.
So what does this all mean? We've forensically audited both sides of this incredibly dense topic. On one hand, the Masoretic syntax in Genesis 1 heavily pushes 24-hour parameters through specific numerical modifiers and strict evening-morning formulas. It is highly regulated. Yet, on the other hand, the semantic expansion in Genesis 2, the missing temporal formula on the seventh day, and the pre-Enlightenment historical data from thinkers like Augustine heavily challenge that demand for absolute rigidity. So, I leave you with this final thought. Does the ancient Hebrew syntax demand a rigid 24-hour lockdown, or does the internal context and historical precedent genuinely allow for epical flexibility? It's a massive question. I'll leave you to weigh the forensic data for yourselves. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.